Most gardeners look at a shady corner of their yard and see a dead zone, a place where nothing grows, a wasted space. But what if I told you that some of the most nutrient-dense, flavorful crops on Earth actually prefer shade over full sun? Here's what the seed companies don't advertise. While everyone's fighting over the sunniest spots in their garden, there's an entire category of crops that will outperform in the very areas you've been ignoring. We're talking about vegetables that taste better, stay tender longer, and require less water when grown in partial shade. And the most surprising one? It's probably sitting in your refrigerator right now, but I guarantee you never thought about growing it in that shaded area behind your garage. In this video, I'm revealing 20 crops that don't just tolerate shade, they actually thrive in it. Some were cultivated for centuries in forest gardens. Others have a biological advantage that makes them superior in low light conditions. And number 14 will completely change how you think about garden planning. By the end of this video, that problem area in your yard is going to become your most productive growing space. For thousands of years, humans didn't garden in wide open fields under blazing sun. Our ancestors cultivated food in forest clearings, beneath canopy trees, in the dappled light of woodland edges. Shade gardening isn't a compromise, it's actually how most food was grown throughout human history. But somewhere along the way, modern agriculture convinced us that every crop needs 8 hours of direct sunlight. That's simply not true. The reality is that many plants evolved in understory environments. They developed mechanisms to capture and use filtered light more efficiently than their sun-loving cousins. Some produce more chlorophyll, others grow larger leaves to maximize photosynthesis. A few even develop better flavor profiles because they're not stressed by intense heat. Understanding which crops naturally thrive in shade transforms your entire approach to garden design. Let's dive into the 20 most productive shade lovers that most gardeners never consider. Now, before we jump into the list, I need to tell you something that might surprise you. Not all of these crops are obscure heirloom varieties or exotic plants you've never heard of. In fact, several of them are probably crops you've tried to grow in full sun and wondered why they bolted too quickly, tasted bitter, or just didn't perform well. That's because you were fighting against their natural preferences. Some of these crops will actually double their harvest time when moved to shade. Others develop sweeter, more complex flavors, and a few, particularly numbers 7, 14, and 18, have fascinating historical connections to shade cultivation that most modern gardening books completely ignore. What you're about to discover isn't just a list, it's a complete rethinking of how you use every square foot of your property. Let's start with the most forgiving shade crop that practically grows itself. Number 1. Lettuce. Let's start with the obvious one that most people get wrong. Lettuce is actually a cool season crop that suffers in full sun. When exposed to intense heat and light, lettuce bolts. It sends up a flower stalk, turns bitter, and becomes inedible within days. But here's what changes everything. In partial shade, lettuce stays in its productive leaf stage for weeks longer. The leaves remain tender, sweet, and crisp. Commercial growers in hot climates actually use shade cloth to simulate the conditions lettuce prefers naturally. Historically, lettuce was grown in Persian gardens under fruit trees, where dappled sunlight kept it cool and productive through summer. The Romans cultivated it in the shade of their villa courtyards. They understood something we've forgotten. Lettuce isn't a sun crop. The practical benefit? You can harvest fresh salad greens continuously from spring through early fall instead of watching your crop bolt after 2 weeks. Plant it under taller crops, along north-facing walls, or beneath trees, and you'll have the most productive lettuce you've ever grown. Number 2. Spinach. Spinach is lettuce's close cousin in shade preference, but even more dramatic in its response to light levels. In full sun, spinach bolts faster than almost any crop in your garden. In shade, it becomes a reliable, long-season producer. Here's the science. Spinach evolved in ancient Persia, in the cooler mountainous regions where it grew among rocks and larger plants. It evolved as an understory crop. When temperatures rise above 75 degrees and sunlight is intense, spinach interprets this as a survival threat and immediately switches to reproduction mode. That's bolting. Move it to partial shade, and suddenly you're working with the plant's biology against its own. The leaves grow larger to capture available light. The plant stays in vegetative growth. And the flavor? Shade-grown spinach is noticeably sweeter because it's not producing stress compounds. Ancient Chinese agricultural texts from over 1,000 years ago specifically recommend growing spinach in the shadow of taller crops. They knew what modern gardeners are just rediscovering. Number 3. Arugula. If you've only tasted arugula from the grocery store, you haven't experienced real arugula. And if you've grown it in full sun, you've tasted why most people think arugula is too peppery. Arugula in full sun becomes aggressively spicy, almost unpleasantly hot. It bolts within 3 weeks. The leaves turn tough and jagged. But in shade, arugula transforms into a completely different vegetable, nutty, slightly peppery, with a complexity that makes it addictive in salads. This crop originated in the Mediterranean, but not in the sun-blasted fields. It grew wild in the partial shade of olive groves and along woodland edges. Italian farmers traditionally planted it between rows of taller crops, using it as a fast-growing understory plant. The practical advantage is incredible. Shade-grown arugula can produce for 2 to 3 months instead of 3 weeks. You can succession plant it every 2 weeks and maintain a productive harvest. And the flavor is so superior that once you taste shade-grown arugula, you'll never go back.
Number 5. Kale. Here's where things get interesting. Most people think kale is indestructible and will grow anywhere. That's partially true. Kale tolerates a wide range of conditions. But kale doesn't just tolerate shade, it actually prefers it. In full sun, especially in warmer climates, kale leaves become tough and bitter. The plant is constantly stressed by heat and intense light. But move kale to partial shade and something remarkable happens. The leaves become tender, almost buttery in texture. The bitterness that makes people hate kale virtually disappears. Scottish farmers who've grown kale for centuries traditionally planted it in the partial shade of stone walls and farm buildings. They discovered that autumn kale, grown in the declining light of shorter days, tasted best. That's not coincidence, it's biology. Kale produces more chlorophyll in lower light conditions, which actually increases its nutritional density. The leaves grow larger to maximize photosynthesis, and because the plant isn't heat-stressed, it diverts energy into producing the nutrients we want instead of defensive compounds that taste bitter. Number 5. Swiss chard. Swiss chard is the workhorse of the shade garden, and most people have no idea. This crop will produce continuously for months in conditions where other vegetables struggle. Chard originated in the Mediterranean region, but its wild ancestors grew in coastal areas with frequent fog and cloud cover. It evolved to thrive in filtered light. When you plant chard in partial shade, you're giving it exactly what it wants. Here's the hidden advantage. Chard in full sun requires constant watering. The large leaves transpire massive amounts of water, and if you can't keep up, the plant suffers. In shade, water requirements drop by nearly half. The leaves stay crisp and vibrant, and the stems, those beautiful rainbow colors, actually develop more intense pigmentation in partial shade because the plant isn't bleached by constant sun exposure. Medieval European monastery gardens always included chard in the shadiest corners of their herb gardens. They understood that this crop was reliable, nutritious, and required minimal intervention. It was often the last crop standing when others failed. Number 6. Asian greens. Bok choy, mizuna, tatsoi, and countless other Asian brassicas. Evolved in agricultural systems that mimicked natural forest ecosystems. They were planted beneath fruit trees, in the dappled shade of bamboo groves, alongside taller crops. Shade isn't a limitation for these plants, it's their native environment. The flavor difference is astounding. Asian greens grown in full sun become spicy, bitter, and tough. They bolt almost immediately. In partial shade, they develop a mild, slightly sweet flavor with a tender texture that makes them perfect for both raw and cooked applications. Chinese agricultural manuals from the Song dynasty described precise planting arrangements where Asian greens were deliberately positioned in the shadow of taller crops. This wasn't random, it was sophisticated agricultural design based on centuries of observation. Number 7. Cilantro. This is the crop that frustrates more gardeners than almost any other. People plant cilantro in full sun, watch it bolt within 2 weeks, and assume they can't grow it. The problem isn't your skill, it's the light exposure. Cilantro is native to regions spanning southern Europe to southwestern Asia, but it originally grew in areas with filtered light and cooler temperatures. It's biologically programmed to bolt at the first sign of heat stress and intense sunlight. That's its survival mechanism. But here's what changes everything. In partial shade, cilantro becomes a different plant. It stays productive for months instead of weeks. The leaves grow larger. The flavor is more pronounced but less soapy. Yes, that soapy taste many people hate is partially a stress response to too much sun. Ancient Egyptian texts reference cilantro cultivation in the shade of date palms. Medieval Persian gardens grew it alongside taller herbs. They understood that cilantro needed protection from intense sun. Modern gardeners are just relearning this wisdom. Number 8. Parsley. Parsley is cilantro's well-behaved cousin, and it has even stronger shade preferences. This biennial herb actually suffers in full sun, developing woody stems and losing its characteristic flavor. In its native Mediterranean habitat, parsley grows wild in the understory of scrubland and forest edges. It's adapted to dappled light and cooler soil temperatures. When you force it into full sun, you're fighting against millions of years of evolution. Shade-grown parsley produces leaves that are larger, tender, and more flavorful. The plant directs energy into leaf production instead of stress management. And here's a bonus. Parsley grown in partial shade is far less attractive to pests. The plant isn't weakened by heat stress, so it maintains stronger natural defenses. Greek and Roman gardeners specifically noted that the best parsley came from shaded gardens. They even had a saying, "Parsley thrives where women rule," which was code for kitchen gardens that were typically located in the shadier, more protected areas near the home. Number 9. Chives. Chives are so easy to grow that most people don't think about optimizing their conditions. But when you move chives to partial shade, something wonderful happens. In full sun, chives become tough and develop an almost onion-like sharpness that overwhelms dishes. In partial shade, the flavor mellows into a delicate, slightly sweet onion taste that's perfect for finishing dishes. Chives are native to cooler climates in Asia and Europe, where they naturally grew in meadows with taller grasses providing dappled shade. They're adapted to compete for light, which means they actually perform better with some shade. The historical record is fascinating. Chinese herbalists from over 2,000 years ago noted that chives grown in half-light had superior medicinal properties. They weren't wrong. Modern analysis shows that shade-grown chives have higher concentrations of beneficial sulfur compounds. Number 10. Mint. If you've ever grown mint, you know it's nearly indestructible. But most people don't realize that mint actually prefers shade. In fact, mint in full sun is a pale shadow of what mint should be. Mint species evolved along stream banks and in woodland edges, places with consistent moisture and filtered light. When you plant mint in full sun, you're surviving, but the essential oils that give mint its characteristic flavor are diminished by heat and intense light. Shade-grown mint produces leaves that are darker green, more aromatic, and significantly higher in essential oil content. The flavor is more complex, less harsh, and the plant grows more vigorously because it's not constantly stressed. Ancient Roman gardens included elaborate mint beds specifically positioned in the shade of walls and buildings. They used mint in everything from beverages to medicines, and they understood that shade-grown mint was superior. Medieval monastery gardens continued this tradition, growing medicinal-grade mint in the shadiest corners of their herb gardens.
Number 11. Peas. Here's a crop that surprises most gardeners. Peas actually benefit from afternoon shade, especially in warmer climates. While peas need some sun to flower and set pods, too much heat and light dramatically shortens their productive season. Peas originated in the Mediterranean and Central Asian regions, but they evolved as a cool season crop that grew during periods of shorter days and milder temperatures. When exposed to intense summer sun, peas shut down production and die back. It's a temperature response, but light intensity accelerates the process. In partial shade, particularly afternoon shade, peas continue producing weeks longer than their full sun counterparts. The pods stay tender instead of becoming tough and starchy, and the flavor, shade-grown peas, are noticeably sweeter. English cottage gardens traditionally planted peas along north-facing walls or in the shade of taller crops. This wasn't accidental. Centuries of observation taught gardeners that protected peas outperformed exposed ones. Number 12. Beans. Bush beans. This might be the most controversial entry on the list, but the evidence is clear. Bush beans in partial shade outperform those in full sun in most home garden situations. Now, commercial bean production requires full sun because industrial agriculture is optimized for maximum production in minimum time, but home gardeners have different goals. We want continuous harvest, superior flavor, and plants that don't require constant intervention. Beans in partial shade produce slowly, but they produce longer. The pods stay tender for days instead of hours. The plants are more resistant to pests because they're not heat-stressed, and the flavor is noticeably better, sweeter, more complex. Indigenous agricultural systems in Central America, where beans originated, used the Three Sisters planting method: corn, beans, and squash, together. The beans grew in the partial shade created by corn stalks. This wasn't primitive agriculture, it was sophisticated ecosystem design. Number 13. Radishes. Radishes are typically considered a full sun crop, but that's only half the story. Spring radishes do fine in sun, but summer radishes, the larger, milder varieties, absolutely prefer shade. In full sun, radishes become stressed and develop that sharp, peppery bite that many people find unpleasant. They often become woody in the center, or split. But in partial shade, radishes develop a mild, crisp, slightly sweet flavor that's completely different. Japanese daikon radishes, which can grow to enormous sizes, were traditionally cultivated in the partial shade of rice paddies and beneath fruit trees. Korean gardeners grew radishes in the filtered light of forest gardens. These weren't shade-tolerant crops, they were shade-preferring crops. The practical advantage? You can grow radishes all summer long in partial shade, something impossible in full sun. The roots stay crisp and mild, perfect for fresh eating or preserving. Number 14. Broccoli. This is the revelation that changes everything for most gardeners. Broccoli isn't just shade-tolerant. In many climates, it absolutely demands partial shade to produce well. Here's what most people experience. They plant broccoli in full sun, it grows well initially, then suddenly bolts and produces tiny, bitter heads. They blame their variety or their timing, but the real culprit is light and heat exposure. Broccoli is a cool season brassica that evolved in the Mediterranean region, but in coastal areas with frequent cloud cover and cool temperatures. It's biologically programmed to head up in cool conditions with moderate light. Intense sun and heat trigger premature bolting. In partial shade, broccoli produces larger heads, stays in production longer, and develops a sweeter, nuttier flavor. The side shoots, those smaller secondary heads, continue producing for months instead of weeks. Italian farmers in traditional agricultural systems grew broccoli in the shade of olive trees and grapevines. They understood that protected broccoli was superior broccoli. Number 15. Cauliflower. Everything true about broccoli applies even more intensely to cauliflower. This crop is notoriously finicky in home gardens, but the solution is almost always shade. Cauliflower requires very specific conditions to form tight white heads. Too much sun, and the heads turn yellow or purple and develop an off flavor. Temperature fluctuations cause the heads to rice or separate into grainy sections. In full sun, these problems are almost inevitable. In partial shade, cauliflower becomes manageable. The heads form slowly and evenly, the white color stays pure, and the flavor is mild and sweet instead of bitter or sulfurous. French market gardeners in the 1800s developed elaborate systems of shade cloth and strategic planting to protect cauliflower from intense sun. They weren't compensating for shade, they were creating it deliberately because shaded cauliflower commanded premium prices. Number 16. Cabbage. Cabbage is another brassica that performs remarkably better in partial shade than most gardeners realize. While it tolerates full sun, cabbage actually develops sweeter flavor and tighter heads when protected from intense afternoon light. The key is understanding cabbage's evolutionary history. This crop originated in coastal Europe, where cool temperatures and frequent cloud cover created naturally filtered light conditions. Cabbage grows slowly, building dense heads over months, and intense sun actually disrupts this process. In full sun, cabbage heads often split as they mature, a frustrating problem caused by rapid growth spurts triggered by heat and intense light. In partial shade, growth is steadier and more controlled. The heads form tight and uniform without splitting, and the outer leaves stay tender instead of becoming tough and leathery. Northern European farmers traditionally planted cabbage in the lee of stone walls or beneath orchard trees. German and Polish agricultural traditions specifically mention shadow cabbage as superior for fermentation into sauerkraut. The slightly lower sugar content and firmer texture of shade-grown cabbage creates better fermentation results. Number 17. Celery. Celery might be the ultimate shade lover on this list. This crop is nearly impossible to grow successfully in full sun without extraordinary effort, but in partial shade, it becomes surprisingly manageable. Here's the biology. Celery is a marsh. Its wild ancestors grew in wetlands with tall reeds and grasses, providing constant shade and moisture. Celery has shallow roots and enormous water requirements. In full sun, it's almost impossible to keep the soil moist enough. The plant becomes stringy, bitter, and develops hollow stalks. In partial shade, everything changes. Water requirements drop significantly, the stalks grow thick and crisp, and the flavor, shade-grown celery, is sweet, aromatic, and tender instead of bitter and fibrous. Ancient Roman gardeners grew celery in deliberately flooded beds positioned in the shade of buildings and walls. They understood that celery needed both moisture and protection from sun. Medieval European gardens continued this practice, treating celery as a specialty crop that required careful site selection. The modern practice of blanching celery by mounding soil around the stalks is actually an attempt to recreate shade conditions. Why fight biology? Just grow it in partial shade from the start.
Number 18. Beets. Beets surprise many gardeners with their shade tolerance. While the roots will size up faster in full sun, beet greens, which are actually more nutritious than the roots, are dramatically better when grown in partial shade. But here's the secret most people miss. Even the roots benefit from shade in warmer climates. In full sun during summer, beets become woody and develop growth rings that make them tough and unpalatable. In partial shade, the roots grow more slowly and develop a tender texture and sweeter flavor. Beets originated in the Mediterranean region, but their wild ancestors grew along coastal areas in the partial shade of dunes and scrub vegetation. They evolved to handle variable light conditions. When Russian and Eastern European farmers developed beets as a staple crop, they often planted them in the partial shade of sunflowers or corn, using companion planting to create ideal growing conditions. The greens are where shade really shines. Beet greens in full sun are tough and strongly flavored. In partial shade, they become tender and mild, rivaling Swiss chard as a cooking green. Number 19. Turnips. Turnips are a forgotten crop for most modern gardeners, but they're incredibly productive in shade conditions that would defeat other root vegetables. Both the roots and the greens thrive in partial shade. In full sun, turnips rush to maturity, often developing a sharp, almost bitter flavor. The roots become pithy and woody if not harvested at exactly the right moment, but in partial shade, turnips grow more slowly and develop a mild, slightly sweet flavor that makes them versatile for both raw and cooked applications. Scottish and Irish agricultural traditions relied heavily on turnips grown in the partial shade of hedgerows and stone walls. These weren't emergency crops, they were deliberately cultivated in shade because generations of observation proved they performed better there. Turnip greens are exceptional in shade. They stay tender and mild all season long, providing a continuous cut-and-come-again harvest.
In southern U.S. culinary traditions, turnip greens are considered superior to the roots, and the best greens always come from shaded plantings. Number 20. Carrots. Here's the final revelation that will completely change how you think about garden planning. Carrots can be successfully grown in partial shade, and in some situations, they actually perform better there. Now, carrots do need some direct sun to develop good root size. They won't thrive in deep shade, but in dappled shade or areas with 4 to 5 hours of direct sun, carrots develop longer, straighter roots with superior flavor. The science is fascinating. In full sun, especially in warmer soils, carrots rush through their growth cycle. The roots are often short, thick, and develop that characteristic carrot bitterness. In partial shade, with cooler soil temperatures, carrots grow more slowly. The roots elongate, develop a finer texture, and concentrate sugars instead of stress compounds. French intensive gardening methods developed in the market gardens around Paris in the 1700s specifically used shade cloth over carrot beds during the hottest parts of summer. These gardeners were producing premium vegetables for wealthy clients, and they discovered that partial shade produced the sweetest, most tender carrots. Medieval European gardens often planted carrots in the dappled shade of fruit trees. Japanese farmers grew carrots beneath bamboo structures that filtered sunlight. The pattern repeats across cultures. Experienced gardeners protect carrots from intense sun. If you're discovering that your problem areas are actually prime gardening real estate, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Every week I share practical growing strategies that challenge conventional gardening wisdom. Your support helps more people discover that limitations are often just misunderstandings waiting to be corrected. Now, here's where this gets really powerful. Everything I've shared so far will transform how you use shaded areas, but there's a deeper pattern here that most gardeners never recognize. The crops that thrive in shade aren't just tolerating poor conditions, they're actually expressing their true genetic potential. We've been conditioned by industrial agriculture to believe that maximum sun equals maximum production, but that's a narrow definition of success designed for mechanized monoculture, not diverse home gardens. When you start thinking in terms of forest garden principles, everything shifts. Instead of fighting your yard's natural conditions, you're working with them. That shady north side of your house? It's not a liability. It's a microclimate perfectly suited for cool season greens. The area under your fruit trees? It's not wasted space. It's an understory waiting to be planted. The most successful gardeners I know aren't the ones with perfect full sun plots. They're the ones who've learned to read their land, identify microclimates, and match crops to conditions. Shade isn't the problem. Mismatched expectations are the problem. And what you do with this knowledge will determine whether you have a productive garden or an exceptional one. There's something profound happening when we stop fighting our gardens and start listening to them. For generations, we've been sold the idea that successful gardening means controlling nature, amending soil, maximizing sun exposure, forcing plants into conditions we think they need. But the wisdom embedded in traditional agricultural systems tells a different story. Forest gardens in Asia, cottage gardens in Europe, indigenous Three Sisters planting in the Americas. These weren't primitive methods, they were sophisticated ecological partnerships. When you plant lettuce in the shade, you're not compromising, you're honoring what that plant has been trying to tell us for thousands of years. You're participating in a relationship instead of imposing a system. The shade in your yard isn't a problem to solve, it's information. It's telling you exactly what wants to grow there. And the moment you start listening, everything becomes easier. Here's the ultimate truth that changes everything. Your shady yard isn't a gardening challenge, it's actually an advantage. While your neighbors are battling heat stress, watering twice daily, and watching crops bolt in full sun, you can be harvesting tender greens, crisp vegetables, and flavorful herbs all season long. The crops I've shared today represent thousands of years of human observation and plant selection. They're not experimental or risky, they're proven performers that have fed civilizations. The only thing experimental is our modern assumption that everything needs maximum sunlight. So walk your property differently now. Those shaded areas you've been ignoring, they're not limitations, they're specialized growing zones waiting for the right crops. And now you know exactly what to plant there. Your shade isn't a curse, it's your secret weapon.
Which of these 20 crops surprised you most? Are you already growing any of them in shade, or are you planning to try something new this season? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and love hearing about your experiences. And if this video changed how you see your yard, subscribe for more practical gardening strategies that challenge conventional thinking. Let's grow smarter together.